The librarian whispered, "You're too loud, come closer," quietly. I didn't know if it was a warning, or an invitation, but the moment her gaze met mine, everything changed. The first time I noticed her, I was fumbling with a stack of books, trying to organize them without drawing too much attention to myself. The library was quiet, almost reverently so, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel amplified. My footsteps echoed softly on the polished floors, and the faint scent of old paper and varnished wood filled the air. That's when I saw her, seated behind the librarian's desk, her posture effortlessly graceful, one hand resting lightly on an open book, the other idly adjusting a pen. She looked up at me, and her eyes, dark, warm, and quietly attentive, measured me in a way that made my chest tighten. "You're too loud," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying a surprising authority that made me freeze mid-step. There was no anger in it, just a gentle correction, an invitation disguised as a reprimand. I felt a strange mix of embarrassment and curiosity, the kind that pulls you forward rather than drives you away. Her hair, dark and glossy, framed her face in loose waves, a few strands tucked neatly behind her ear. The faint perfume she wore was delicate and floral, weaving subtly with the scent of old books, and for a moment, it was all I could notice. My hands, still balancing the uneven stack of novels, felt awkward, almost clumsy, but I couldn't help stealing another glance. There was a quiet confidence in her movements, a subtle elegance that made her presence feel almost magnetic. As I approached, she didn't look away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if encouraging me to come closer while silently testing how I'd respond. I could feel my pulse quicken, not just from the unexpected attention, but from a sudden awareness of how close proximity could feel charged with something unspoken. The library's ambient hum, the flipping of pages, the soft squeak of chairs, seemed to fade into the background. All I could focus on was the subtle way she held herself, the gentle curve of her smile as she watched me, and the way her quiet composure contrasted sharply with my nervous energy. In that instant, I realized that something as simple as being too loud could become the beginning of something far more complex. Her presence drew me in, compelling me to tread carefully, to notice everything, every detail of her expression, every nuance of her voice. And just like that, a spark of curiosity and intrigue was lit, subtle but undeniable, setting the stage for a connection I hadn't expected, yet couldn't ignore. It happened by accident, as most meaningful moments often do. I was helping to reorganize a section of the library, shifting a few books from one shelf to another, trying desperately to stay quiet so I wouldn't earn another soft reprimand from her. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead mixed with the faint rustle of pages, creating a cocoon of quiet that seemed to amplify every small movement. I reached for a volume on the middle shelf at the exact moment she did. Our hands brushed, just briefly, but the effect was immediate. A jolt of warmth ran through me, startling and intimate all at once. Her fingers were soft but purposeful, and the slight pressure lingered in my memory long after our hands separated. I felt a flush creep up my neck, and for a moment, I wasn't entirely sure whether to laugh nervously or apologize. She simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that hinted she had noticed exactly how much the brief touch had affected me. The scent of her, soft, floral, comforting, seemed stronger in that moment, mixed subtly with the faint mustiness of the books around us. I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes caught the light, glinting with a quiet amusement. She tilted her head slightly, and I felt the world shrink to the small space between us, the shared warmth of proximity, the faint friction of clothing as we both leaned toward the shelf. There was something about the accidental nature of it that made it feel significant. Nothing was said, no words were necessary, but the air between us hummed with awareness. She didn't pull away immediately, she lingered just long enough to acknowledge the brush of fingers, letting the tension stretch in a way that was both playful and meaningful. I laughed softly, shaking my head at my own nerves, and she chuckled too, the sound low and melodic, blending seamlessly with the quiet library atmosphere. It wasn't a grand gesture, no dramatic declaration, it was far more intimate than that. It was a small, shared acknowledgement that neither of us could quite ignore, that our presence, our proximity, meant something more than just routine. As I stepped back, adjusting the books in my hands to cover the slight tremor, I realized that this library, once a place of quiet study, had suddenly become a space charged with anticipation. Her attention, so effortlessly focused on me, and the subtle, accidental touch of our hands had ignited something I couldn't name yet, but couldn't stop thinking about. And just like that, the slow, irresistible pull of curiosity and attraction began to take root, quietly, persistently, leaving me both unsettled and eager for the next accidental encounter. After the brief, accidental closeness, a subtle shift began to take shape between us. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, just a gentle, unspoken understanding that made our interactions feel charged with something more than ordinary courtesy. The library, always a haven of quiet, seemed to stretch around us, giving room for small conversations that lingered longer than necessary, yet never felt rushed. It started with books, always books. She would recommend one title, and I would find a reason to linger near her desk while discussing its themes. Our voices were low, almost conspiratorial, blending with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of pages. Every word felt deliberate, every pause meaningful. I found myself leaning in slightly, careful to respect the quiet, but eager to catch every inflection in her tone. Her gestures were mesmerizing in their subtlety. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed the faint warmth of her fingers as they briefly grazed her cheek. When she laughed softly at something I said, the sound was like a gentle ripple through the calm library air, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. The warmth of her gaze lingered longer than necessary, making me painfully aware of every movement, every detail of her presence. We began to share small pieces of ourselves in these quiet exchanges. She mentioned a memory from her youth, a book that had changed her perspective, a fleeting regret she rarely voiced aloud. I listened, careful to absorb every word, and responded with the honesty of my own experiences, letting her see the parts of me I usually kept hidden. Our voices dropped even lower as the library emptied further, creating a private bubble where vulnerability felt safe. There was a magnetic tension in the space between us, unspoken, yet palpable. Her hand would occasionally hover near mine when passing a book, and I felt a thrill from the proximity, a silent acknowledgement of a growing connection. I found myself noticing everything, the tilt of her head, the softness in her eyes, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she exhaled. By the time our quiet conversation ended, I was left with a strange mix of anticipation and calm. The library hadn't changed, the books remained in their orderly rows, but something in me had shifted. In those moments, I realized the slow, subtle intimacy we were building wasn't just about words or touches, it was about being truly seen. And in being seen, we were both daring to step closer, quietly, towards something that neither of us could yet name, but that we both felt would shape the days to come. By now, the quiet familiarity between us had begun to settle into something more comfortable, yet unpredictably charged. The library had become our little stage, and every interaction carried the subtle undertone of playful challenge. It wasn't dramatic, there were no overt declarations, but each exchange made my pulse quicken in ways I hadn't anticipated. It began with small, teasing moments. She would place a book just out of reach, her eyes sparkling with amusement as I stretched awkwardly to grab it. "You're too slow," she would say lightly, the corners of her lips curling into a mischievous smile. I would feign frustration, playfully shaking my head, only to notice the way her eyes crinkled in laughter. Every shared glance, every small gesture, carried the weight of something unspoken, something quietly magnetic. Our interactions became a delicate dance of proximity and awareness. As I leaned forward to retrieve a book she deliberately positioned on a higher shelf, our hands brushed, again, slightly, intentionally, each time lingering just a fraction longer than the last. The warmth of her skin against mine sent a subtle shiver up my spine, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was grounding, reminding me that our connection existed in these small, deliberate touches. Even the smallest physicalities, the light tap of her finger on a spine to correct my angle, the gentle nudge as she guided me past a narrow aisle, felt intimate. The air around us seemed charged, but it wasn't suffocating. There was laughter, soft and melodic, that echoed lightly against the high shelves, blending with the faint rustle of pages. It was as if the library itself had softened, creating a cocoon where playfulness and attraction could coexist safely. Beyond the physical gestures, our words became layered with subtext. She would challenge me on trivial matters. "You really think that author understood human nature?" And I would respond with earnest insistence, aware of the playful spark in her gaze. Every debate, every teasing remark, carried an unspoken acknowledgement that we were aware of one another in ways no one else might notice. By the time the afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the library windows, the playful challenges had drawn us closer, emotionally and physically. The teasing was more than humor, it was a bridge between curiosity and desire, a safe way to explore intimacy without words, without forcing anything. In that shared space of laughter, light touches, and lingering glances, I began to understand that this slow, careful dance was as much about trust and emotional closeness as it was about attraction. And with every challenge she playfully set, I found myself leaning in, eager, nervous, yet quietly thrilled to meet her there. It was one of those rare, quiet afternoons when the library seemed suspended in time. The usual hum of activity had faded, only the faint rustle of pages and the occasional creak of the floorboards punctuated the air. I found myself lingering near her desk, unsure whether to speak or simply stay in the shared silence. She noticed my hesitation and offered a small, inviting smile, the kind that felt like a soft pull, gentle but irresistible. Then, unexpectedly, she shared something personal, a memory or a regret she seldom voiced aloud. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, carrying a subtle tremor that betrayed a vulnerability she rarely revealed. I listened intently, each word settling in the quiet space between us. The library walls seemed to draw closer, as if acknowledging the weight of the moment. I could see the careful way she kept her hands close to her, yet every so often, her fingers grazed the desk in a natural gesture that made the space feel intimate. I responded with my own quiet honesty, choosing my words with care. I shared a personal thought, a fleeting fear, a hope I had rarely voiced. She tilted her head slightly, eyes never leaving mine, and for a moment, it felt as though we were suspended together in a bubble of understanding. Her gaze softened, and a subtle warmth spread across her features, making her look even more alive in the stillness of the library. Then, without warning, her hand brushed mine, lightly, almost accidentally. The contact was brief, but the warmth lingered, spreading from my palm through my chest. It was neither rushed nor overt, it was simply an acknowledgement that, in this moment, we were present for each other in a way that mattered. The gentle pressure of her touch, paired with the softness of her voice and the depth of her words, created a quiet intimacy that neither of us had experienced before. Time seemed to stretch as we held that silent connection. There was no need for grand gestures, no urgency for declaration. The emotional closeness, the vulnerability we had shared, was enough to speak volumes. Her presence, steady and graceful, reassured me, while the subtle energy between us hinted at a deeper bond forming. As I left her side that day, I carried a lingering sense of warmth and anticipation. The library, once a space of mere study and order, had transformed into a sanctuary where emotional intimacy could flourish. In her quiet, careful openness, I realized that our connection was no longer just curiosity or playful tension, it had deepened into something meaningful, something quietly profound, waiting to grow. By now, our connection had grown into something both undeniable and unspoken. The playful teasing and quiet conversations had given way to a deeper awareness, a shared space where words were almost unnecessary. Each time we were near each other, I felt the subtle tension in the air, like a quiet current beneath the surface, guiding every glance, every movement. It was during one of those ordinary library afternoons that the awareness hit hardest. I was shelving books near her desk when our paths crossed in a narrow aisle. Our shoulders brushed, fleetingly, and I felt the warmth linger longer than it should have. She didn't step away immediately, instead, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes meeting mine with a steady, knowing gaze that made my chest tighten. It was a silent acknowledgement, a quiet agreement that the tension between us had deepened into something more. The air seemed charged in subtle ways. Every minor contact, a hand passing near mine, a brief touch on the spine of a book, the accidental brushing of arms, carried weight. My pulse quickened each time, a mix of anticipation and restraint. She laughed softly at something I said, the sound low and intimate, and I felt drawn in closer, aware of the space we shared, of the quiet energy vibrating between us. There was also an unspoken hesitancy. Neither of us crossed the line into overt intimacy, but the longing was clear in the way our movements synchronized. When she handed me a book, her fingers lingered near mine, and our eyes met, holding each other's gaze just a moment too long. That brief, almost imperceptible touch spoke volumes, the acknowledgement of mutual desire without the need for words. Even the quietest moments became charged. Sitting near each other at the library table, we would both reach for the same book, our hands brushing in a rhythm that was almost deliberate, almost teasing. I noticed the way her hair fell across her shoulders when she leaned forward, the subtle warmth of her proximity, the steady rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. Each small gesture, each lingering glance, was a step closer to recognition, a shared understanding that our connection was real, urgent, and compelling. By the end of the day, as I left the library, the pull between us was impossible to ignore. The desire wasn't loud or desperate, it was quiet, simmering, a constant awareness of each other's presence. It was the kind of tension that made every glance, every touch, every soft word feel electric. In that shared silence, I realized that we both knew, without saying it aloud, that the bond forming between us was deep, meaningful, and ready to evolve. The days that followed our subtle recognition of one another's feelings felt lighter somehow, though no words were needed to define the bond that had quietly taken hold. The library, once merely a place of order and study, had transformed into a private refuge, a space where time slowed and the world beyond seemed distant. Each visit carried the gentle promise of connection, the anticipation of small gestures that spoke louder than anything verbal could. That afternoon, I found her seated at the same desk, her posture relaxed, a soft smile gracing her lips. As I approached, she didn't speak first, and I didn't either. Instead, we shared the simple, profound intimacy of presence. I sat across from her, careful not to crowd her, yet aware of the warmth radiating from her as if the space between us was charged with quiet electricity. Her hand rested near mine on the table, fingers occasionally brushing against mine, light, unhurried, deliberate in the gentlest way. We began reading, our attention on the books before us, yet it was impossible to ignore the subtle rhythm of closeness. Every glance, every flicker of a smile, every soft sigh became a wordless conversation. She leaned slightly toward me at one point, just enough that the warmth of her shoulder brushed mine. I felt her heartbeat, a slow, steady pulse that seemed to synchronize with my own, and it was in that rhythm that I realized how deeply intertwined our presence had become. We didn't need grand gestures. No declarations were necessary. The intimacy of leaning close, of sharing silence, of brushing fingertips, was enough. Her head eventually rested lightly on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of her trust, the gentle steadiness of her breath against me. It was comforting and thrilling all at once, a testament to the emotional closeness we had nurtured over days and weeks of quiet moments. In those final moments, the age gap felt irrelevant. There was no need to define it aloud, because respect, care, and mutual understanding had made it natural. I could feel her confidence and life experience harmonizing with my own youthful curiosity, creating a balance that was tender, warm, and undeniably intimate. As we sat together in silence, the library enveloping us in its soft, muted light, I realized the story had already been told, not through dramatic confessions, but through a series of quiet, meaningful choices, touches, and moments. The tension, curiosity, and longing had resolved into a deep, abiding connection, a bond that was complete, satisfying, and profoundly human. In that calm, shared space, we didn't need anything more, our hearts had already recognized each other, and that recognition, quiet and unwavering, was enough. If you felt the slow-burn tension and quiet moments between them, don't miss the full story. Click the link in the description to experience the complete journey of this unexpected connection.